40 years ago, I saved a Bigfoot's life, and in return, he showed me exactly why his kind has stayed hidden from humanity for centuries. I'm 67 years old now, and for 4 decades, I've carried a secret that has haunted every moment of my existence, not because of what I found, but because of what I learned. My name is James Sullivan. I was a hunting guide in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, and in November of 1985, I made a choice that would cost me my marriage, my business, and any chance at a normal life. But what he revealed to me, slowly, painfully, over years of broken communication and trust, changed everything. I thought I understood about intelligence, memory, and why some species learn that survival means invisibility. This is the story I've kept silent about, the one that's made me question whether some truths protect or endanger the innocent. Because what I discovered is that Bigfoot doesn't hide from us out of shyness or instinct. They hide because they remember. And what they remember about humanity is absolutely terrifying. November 12, 1985. Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, Washington State, approximately 14 miles northeast of the town of Concrete, temperature was dropping fast, maybe 28 degrees, and the sky had that pregnant gray quality that promised heavy snow within hours. I was on a solo scouting trip, mapping trails and checking game signs for the upcoming late-season elk hunts I'd be guiding. That December, I'd been a hunting guide for 8 years by then, knew these mountains like the veins on the back of my hands, and I was comfortable being alone in wilderness that made most people nervous. I'd left my truck at the logging road terminus around 6 a.m., packed light, just day gear, rifle, radio, basic first aid, thermos of coffee. The plan was simple. Check 3 potential elk corridors, note any fresh rubs or scat, maybe glass the high meadows if the clouds lifted, standard pre-season reconnaissance. By 2 p.m., I'd covered maybe 9 miles, mostly ridge walking through old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. The forest was quiet that day, too quiet actually, something I noted but didn't think much about at the time. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, just wind in the high branches and my boots crunching through frost-brittle undergrowth. Around 2:45, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew, and I knew them all. It was a vocalization, guttural, almost subsonic bass notes punctuated by these high-pitched keening sounds that made my chest vibrate and my teeth ache, not aggressive. Distressed, panicked, and smart. That's what struck me immediately. The pattern of it, the way the sounds modulated like language, like someone trying to articulate pain they couldn't quite express. It was coming from a ravine about 200 yards west, down a steep grade covered in devil's club and salmonberry thickets. I found him in a clearing at the ravine bottom, and even now, 40 years later, I can close my eyes and see every detail with perfect clarity. He was massive. I'd estimate 8 feet 2 inches tall, maybe 650 pounds. Dark reddish-brown hair covering most of his body, longer on the shoulders and back, shorter on the face and palms. But what stopped me cold, what made me forget every hunting instinct and just stand there frozen 30 feet away, was the bear trap. Someone, some sadistic asshole, had set an illegal trap, the old-fashioned kind with serrated jaws, and this creature had stepped right into it. The trap had closed on his left ankle, and he'd clearly been there for hours, maybe since the night before. The snow around him was torn up from his struggles, and there was blood, a lot of blood, splattered in a circle maybe 15 feet in diameter. His leg was mangled. I could see bone. The trap had bitten clean through muscle and tendon, and his foot was twisted at an unnatural angle. He was sitting now, exhausted from fighting, both hands gripping the trap's jaws, trying with everything he had to pry them apart. His hands, God, his hands. They weren't paws, they were hands, 5 fingers, opposable thumbs, fingernails, not claws, covered in hair, yes, but unmistakably hands that could grip and manipulate and create. And his face? I'd expected something ape-like, primitive, but his face had a forehead, expressive eyebrows, a nose that was flat but not snout-like. His eyes were deep-set, brown, and when he looked up and saw me standing there, I saw something I'll never forget. Intelligence, clear, unmistakable, terrified intelligence. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 5 seconds. He stopped pulling at the trap, stopped making sounds, just looked at me with an expression I can only describe as resignation, like he'd been caught, and now the worst thing he could imagine was about to happen. His chest was heaving. I could see his heart pounding through his rib cage. But he wasn't snarling or displaying aggression. He was just watching me, waiting to see what this human would do to him. In that moment, I understood something profound. He knew what I was. He recognized me as human, and he was absolutely terrified of me. Every instinct I had as a guide, as someone who'd dealt with dangerous wildlife for years, was screaming at me to back away. This was an unknown predator, injured, desperate, unpredictable. I had a rifle. I could end this, report it, let the authorities deal with it. But I couldn't move, because I wasn't looking at an animal. I was looking at someone in agony, someone who'd been caught in a trap meant for bears, someone who was bleeding out and knew it, and was waiting for me to either help or deliver the killing blow. I lowered my rifle, set it against a tree, held up both hands, palms out, the universal gesture for I'm not a threat. And I started talking. Easy, I said, my voice shaking. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to help. Okay? Just stay calm. Let me help. I have no idea if he understood the words, but he understood the tone. His posture changed slightly, not relaxed but less rigid, with absolute terror. I approached slowly, circling wide so I wasn't coming straight at him, talking the whole time. Soft, steady, the voice I'd use with a spooked horse. When I got within 10 feet, I could smell him, earthy, musky like bear, but different, cleaner somehow. And I could see the intelligence in his eyes, tracking my every movement, calculating, deciding whether to let me get closer or use his last strength to fight. It took me 20 minutes to get that trap open. It was old, rusted, the spring mechanism corroded but still viciously tight. I used a fallen branch as a lever, wedging it between the jaws, throwing all my weight onto it. He watched me the whole time, occasionally making soft huffing sounds that I interpreted as pain or maybe encouragement. When the jaws finally released with a metal shriek, he yanked his leg free and immediately tried to stand. He got about 3 feet up before his ruined ankle gave out and he collapsed. The sound he made then, a low, agonized moan, nearly broke my heart. I knew that sound. I'd heard it from wounded animals my whole life. Pure suffering. I didn't think, I just acted. I pulled out my first aid kit, completely inadequate for a wound this severe, and started cleaning the injury with water from my canteen. He flinched but didn't pull away. I packed the wound with gauze, knowing it wasn't enough, knowing he needed antibiotics and possibly surgery and certainly more care than I could provide in a ravine in the wilderness. I used my belt and a stick to make a tourniquet above the wound to slow the bleeding. And the whole time, he watched me with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and I swear I could see him understanding what I was doing, recognizing care, recognizing help. When I was done, I sat back, breathing hard, my hands covered in his blood. He looked at his wrapped leg, then at me, then at his leg again. And then he did something that changed everything. He reached out, slowly, carefully, and touched my shoulder, just rested his massive hand there for a moment. The gesture was so clearly deliberate, so unmistakably a communication of gratitude or acknowledgement, that I felt tears burning in my eyes. "You're welcome," I said stupidly, "but you need more help than this. You need—" I stopped. What did I think I was going to do? Call a veterinarian? Report a mythical creature to the authorities? Take him to a hospital? That's when I made the decision that would define the next 40 years of my life. I couldn't leave him here to die. I couldn't call anyone without risking his capture, study, or worse. I was 12 miles from my truck, the storm was coming, and I had a critically injured cryptid who'd shown me more trust in 20 minutes than he probably should have. "I'm going to help you," I told him. "I'm going to come back with supplies, medicine, food, and I'm not going to tell anyone about you. I promise." He didn't respond, couldn't respond. But the way he looked at me, I knew he understood the commitment I was making. I marked the location carefully, gave him the rest of my water and the sandwich from my pack, and headed back toward civilization. The snow started falling before I'd gone a mile. By the time I reached my truck, I was hiking through 4 inches of fresh powder and questioning my sanity. But I kept seeing those eyes, that hand on my shoulder, that trust. I drove to the nearest town, bought every first aid supply I could carry, antibiotics meant for livestock, protein bars, camping gear, and headed back into the mountains. It took me 5 hours to find the ravine again in the storm. He was still there, unconscious now, his breathing shallow. I set up a tarp shelter, built a small fire that I prayed no one would see, and stayed with him through the night. That was November 12, 1985, the day I stopped being just a hunting guide and became the keeper of the world's most important secret. The lies started immediately. I told my wife Linda that I'd picked up some extra guide work for the winter, scouting for a logging company. I told my business partner Mike that I was dealing with personal stuff and needed some space. I canceled my December hunts, cost me about $8,000 in deposits I had to refund, and essentially disappeared into the mountains for weeks at a time. I became the guy everyone in concrete whispered about. James Sullivan lost his mind, spending all his time in the woods, marriage falling apart. They weren't wrong about the marriage Linda gave me until January before she moved back to Seattle. Can't say I blamed her. That first month was pure survival mode. The leg wound was severely infected within 3 days despite the antibiotics I'd obtained, veterinary tetracycline meant for horses, the strongest thing I could get without a prescription. I was hiking in supplies every other day, medical supplies, food, tarps, blankets. I'd set up a rudimentary camp in that ravine, using natural features and fallen trees to create a shelter that would be invisible from above. I couldn't risk a proper tent. Too visible. Everything had to blend in. He was feverish for almost 2 weeks, delirious. During that time, he'd make these sounds, not the distress calls from that first day, but something else, vocalizations that sounded almost like words, like he was speaking to others who weren't there. Sometimes he'd reach out like he was grasping for someone. Family, I realized. He had family somewhere, and here he was, trapped with a human, unable to return to them. The guilt of that nearly crushed me. I cleaned the wound twice daily, changed bandages, administered antibiotics. I learned that his biology wasn't that different from ours. He ran fevers, fought infection, responded to the same medicines. I learned he was omnivorous. He'd eat the protein bars, the jerky, the dried fruit I brought. He preferred raw vegetables when I could manage them, carrots, potatoes, greens. He'd sniff everything first, cautious but not paranoid, and he drank water constantly, especially during the fever. The breakthrough came in early January 1986. His fever had broken. The wound was finally starting to close properly, and he was alert again. I was changing his bandage, talking to him like I'd been doing for weeks, narrating my actions, explaining what I was doing, just filling the silence. "This is going to hurt for a second," I said, peeling away the old gauze. And he grunted, not in pain, but in acknowledgement. Then he looked directly at me and made a gesture. He brought his hand to his chest, then pointed at his leg, then at me, then made a motion like cradling something. The meaning was unmistakable. "You're taking care of me." I nearly dropped the medical supplies. "Yes," I said, probably too loud. "Yes, I'm taking care of you. You understand?" He did it again, the same sequence. Deliberate, intentional. This wasn't mimicry or accident. This was communication. I sat down hard, my hands shaking. Can you understand me?" The words? He tilted his head, considering, then made a so-so gesture with his hand. Some, not all, but some. My God. I was having a conversation with a Bigfoot. Over the following months, we developed a routine. I'd hike in every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. A 24-mile round trip each time, 4 hours each way. If I pushed it, I brought food, medical supplies, sometimes books or magazines, testing whether he had any interest in human artifacts. He did. He was particularly fascinated by photographs, not of people, but of landscapes, animals, forests. He'd study them for hours, sometimes pointing to an image and then to a direction, like he was saying, "I've been there," or "I know this place." By March, he was mobile again. The ankle had healed, though he walked with a permanent limp. And that's when the real challenge began. We needed to move. The ravine was too exposed, too close to hiking trails that would see traffic. Once spring arrived, I scouted for weeks, looking for somewhere more remote, more secure. I found it in May, a cave system about 30 miles deeper into the wilderness, accessible only by a treacherous climb through deadfall and cliff faces. No trails nearby, no reason for anyone to be there, hidden by rock faces and dense forest. Moving him there was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. We had to travel at night, moving slowly because of his limp, following creek beds to avoid leaving tracks. It took us 3 nights to cover the distance, and every moment I was terrified we'd be seen. That someone with night vision equipment or a spotlight would catch us, that this creature I'd spent 6 months protecting would be exposed because I'd screwed up. But we made it, and the cave became home. In June, a hiker went missing on the Pacific Crest Trail section that passes within a few miles of where we'd originally been. Volunteers, then county sheriff, then eventually state search and rescue flooded the area. For 5 days there were helicopters, search parties with dogs, hundreds of people combing through the forest. I had to stay away, couldn't risk leading anyone to him. But I was terrified the whole time. What if they found the ravine? What if they found evidence of our camp? What if the search dogs picked up his scent? They didn't. The hiker was eventually found, had fallen, broken his leg, survived by drinking creek water until a search dog located him. But during those 5 days, I aged about 5 years. Every helicopter that passed overhead, I imagined them seeing heat signatures, seeing the cave. I couldn't contact him, couldn't check on him, couldn't know if he was okay, or if he was terrified by all the human activity. When I finally made it back to the cave after the search ended, he was deeper in the system than usual, hiding in a chamber that required crawling through a narrow passage. He'd been smart. He'd stayed hidden. But I could see the stress in his eyes. He knew how close they'd come. That fall, during hunting season, a solo bow hunter decided to explore off-trail and ended up within 500 yards of the cave entrance. I was there when it happened. We heard him coming, crashing through brush, not bothering with stealth, probably tracking an elk. I looked at my companion. That's what I'd started calling him in my mind, just companion, because I had no name for him and he'd offered none, and gestured frantically, "Hide, be silent, don't move." He was already ahead of me, already melting back into the cave shadows, moving with impossible silence for something so large. The hunter passed within visual range of the entrance. He never looked directly at it. The rock face and vegetation camouflaged it perfectly, but he paused, sniffed the air, frowned. I was frozen behind a boulder, barely breathing. If he investigated further, if he came closer, there was no way he wouldn't see evidence of habitation. We'd been living there for months. There were supplies, gear, the remains of campfires. He stood there for maybe 3 minutes, felt like 3 hours, then shook his head and moved on. Probably dismissed whatever he'd smelled as bear or elk. When he was gone, when I could no longer hear any sound of him, I went to find my companion. He was in the deepest part of the cave, pressed against the back wall, his body language radiating fear, not of the hunter specifically, but of what the hunter represented: humans. Discovery, the end of safety. I sat with him for an hour, not saying anything, just being present, until his breathing slowed and the tension left his shoulders. By the first anniversary of our meeting, November 1986, our relationship had fundamentally changed. I'd started bringing him gifts, a harmonica that he could never quite figure out how to play, but seemed to enjoy the sound of, a thick wool blanket that became his prized possession, a rubber ball that he'd roll back and forth idly while sitting. And he'd started leaving things for me. Smooth river stones stacked in careful cairns outside the cave entrance, like a welcome marker. Once a deer hide he'd somehow acquired and processed, clean and soft, which I later made into a pouch. The communication had evolved. He'd learned maybe 20 or 30 of my words. Food, water, danger, quiet, okay, sleep, cold, fire, basic survival vocabulary, and he'd taught me some of his vocalizations. A specific huffing pattern meant warning, a lower rumble meant contentment. A clicking sound meant question or curiosity. We weren't fluent in each other's languages, but we were conversational. More importantly, he'd started initiating contact. Small things, touching my arm to get my attention, offering me food first before eating his own, once, memorably, brushing snow off my shoulders when I arrived during a winter storm, the gesture so human, so caring, that I had to turn away before he saw me cry. Whatever this relationship was, it had moved beyond rescuer and rescued. We were companions, friends, maybe even, in some undefined way, family. But the cost was mounting. My marriage was over. Divorce papers arrived in March 1987. My business had collapsed. Mike had bought me out for pennies on the dollar. My friends had stopped calling. People in concrete thought I'd had a breakdown, become a hermit, maybe developed a drinking problem. I'd lost probably 40 pounds from the constant hiking and inconsistent eating. I looked like hell. But when I was in that cave, sitting by a carefully concealed fire, watching my companion examine a magazine or carefully groom his fur, or simply breathe in that deep, contented way that meant he felt safe, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. This was the most important thing I'd ever done, the only thing that truly mattered. And I was only just beginning to understand how deep this rabbit hole went. The late 80s were about establishing sustainability. I couldn't keep living off savings and odd jobs while hiking 24 miles 3 times a week. I needed income, I needed a cover story, and I needed to be closer. In 1988, I bought a rundown cabin on 40 acres about 15 miles from the cave, close enough to visit every day, remote enough that nobody bothered me. I told people I was writing a book about wilderness survival. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was documenting everything, filling notebooks with observations, sketches, behavioral notes. Not for publication, never for publication, but because what I was witnessing felt too important to exist only in my memory. I took work as a fire watcher for the Forest Service, seasonal, solitary, perfect cover. I'd spend weeks in a tower, officially watching for smoke, actually planning supply runs, and worrying about my companion. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was employed to protect the forest while keeping its most important resident a secret from my employers. During this period, I learned the rhythms of his existence. He was nocturnal by preference, most active in the hours between sunset and dawn. During the day, he'd sleep deeply, curled in the back of the cave, occasionally snoring, a deep rattling sound that I found oddly comforting. He was meticulous about cleanliness, grooming his fur carefully, bathing in the creek when weather permitted, keeping his sleeping area fastidiously organized. He was territorial about the cave, marking the entrance area with, there's no delicate way to say this, urine, asserting ownership the way many animals do. But inside, everything was arranged with clear intention: sleeping area, eating area. Storage, where he kept the items I brought, even what I thought of as a thinking spot, near the entrance where he'd sit and look out at the forest for hours. I brought him books during this time, testing his capacity for understanding human symbols. He wasn't interested in text. The letters meant nothing to him, but he'd study photographs obsessively, particularly wildlife photographs, especially of apes and primates. Once I brought him a National Geographic with a feature on mountain gorillas. He looked at those images for what must have been an hour, touching the photographs gently, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost mournful. I wondered if he saw something familiar there, some kinship he recognized. The early 90s brought breakthrough after breakthrough in our ability to communicate. I'd started using simple sign language, not formal ASL, but basic gestures I'd invented, and taught him point to mouth, eat, point to eyes, see, touch chest, me, point outward, you. He picked it up astonishingly fast. Within months we had maybe 100 signs, enough for basic conversation. You hungry? Yes? Danger outside? No. Safe. Sleep now? Not yet. But the real revelation came when I brought him a child's picture book, one of those basic vocabulary books with simple illustrations: cat, dog, house, tree. I was using it to expand our shared vocabulary, pointing to pictures and teaching him my words while he taught me his sounds. We were on a page showing different emotions: happy face, sad face, angry face, scared face. And he pointed to the scared face, then to himself, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass everything: the world, life, existence. He was scared, not in that moment, not of immediate danger, but fundamentally his default state was fear. "Why?" I asked, not expecting an answer, but he tried to give me one. He pointed to the scared face again, then to a picture of people in the book, then to himself and made a gesture like hiding, then to the people picture again, and made a striking motion: people, hiding, people, hitting. The equation was simple and devastating. People meant danger. People meant pain. His species had learned to hide because humans meant violence. I sat there with that children's book in my hands, understanding with sudden horrible clarity why I'd never seen others of his kind, why they were ghosts in the forest, why every close call sent him into such profound terror. It wasn't instinct. It was learned. It was cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Avoid humans at all costs because humans kill. I tried to tell him that not all humans were dangerous, that I would never hurt him. But how could I make that argument? I was an outlier, an exception, and for all he knew, I might be the only non-violent human who'd ever known of his existence. By the mid-90s, I'd essentially sacrificed any semblance of a normal life. I was 50 years old, living alone in a cabin, working minimal hours, spending every spare moment with a creature the world didn't believe existed. I had no romantic relationships. How could I? "Sorry, I can't make dinner. I need to bring antibiotics to my Bigfoot friend," wasn't going to fly. I had superficial friendships, the kind where people don't ask too many questions about what you do with your time. I'd become skilled at deflection, at seeming friendly while revealing nothing. But in that cave, I had something most people never find: absolute trust, complete acceptance, a relationship built on mutual dependence and genuine affection. He'd greet me now when I arrived, a soft, huffing vocalization that clearly meant pleasure. He'd share food with me, not just accepting what I brought, but offering me things he'd gathered: berries, roots, once a particularly delicious type of mushroom that I later identified as chanterelle. He'd learned to be gentle with his strength, aware that what was a light touch to him could bowl me over. January of 1994 brought the worst storm I'd seen in 20 years. Temperature dropped to zero, wind howling at 60 miles per hour, snow falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. I'd stayed at the cave, couldn't have made it back to the cabin if I'd tried. We were trapped together for 3 days while the storm raged outside, the wind making sounds like screaming, the temperature in the cave barely above freezing. Even with our fire, we rationed food, shared the one good blanket, sat close together for warmth, which would have been unthinkable years earlier, but now felt natural. On the second night, huddled together, he did something extraordinary. He started making sounds, not the vocalizations I knew, but something else, rhythmic, melodic, almost like singing, but deeper, with harmonics that resonated in my chest. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, this strange, beautiful song. And when he finished, he looked at me expectantly. I understood. He'd shared something cultural, something meaningful, and he wanted me to do the same, so I sang. Badly, self-consciously, an old folk song my grandfather taught me, Shenandoah. He listened with what I can only describe as rapt attention, and when I finished, he made a sound that I interpreted as approval. We'd shared culture, music, the universal language. The late 90s and early 2000s brought the reality of aging to our relationship. I was in my mid-50s, he was. I had no idea how old, but he was graying. His face, his shoulders, his chest, hair turning silver gray. He moved more slowly. The ankle injury from that first day had led to arthritis that was clearly painful in cold weather. I brought him ibuprofen, which helped, but I worried constantly. What happened if he got seriously ill? What would I do if he died? Could I even report it? Would his body be confiscated, studied, his dignity violated in death? and there were practical challenges mounting. The forest was changing. In 1999, a development company bought land adjacent to the national forest, planning to build luxury cabins. Survey crews started appearing in areas they'd never been before. More hikers, more mountain bikers, more people. The solitude that had protected us was eroding. We had several close calls, voices in the distance that sent us into silent lockdown mode, helicopters that hovered too long, once a group of teenagers who'd apparently heard stories about Bigfoot in the area and came looking with cameras and beer, thinking it was a joke. In July 1999, a surveyor from the development company literally stumbled onto the cave entrance. I was there, thank God, and was able to intercept him before he got too close. My companion was deeper in, silent and hidden. The surveyor, young guy, maybe 25, said he was mapping property boundaries and had gotten turned around. I played the territorial hermit role perfectly, gruff, unfriendly, told him this was my land, a lie, and he was trespassing. He apologized, seemed nervous. I probably looked half crazy, which wasn't far from the truth, and left. But he'd seen the general area. He'd been too close. We spent the next week camouflaging the entrance even more thoroughly, moving loose rocks, encouraging vegetation growth, making it look like solid cliff face. It worked. The survey maps later showed no indication of the cave system, but it had been too close. In April of 2002, I turned 60. Birthdays had stopped meaning much to me years ago, but I mentioned it to my companion. We'd developed enough communication that I could convey the concept of marking the annual cycle of my life. The next time I visited, he gave me something I still have, still treasure. It was a carving. Wood, about 8 inches tall, roughly humanoid but clearly representing one of his species. The detail was remarkable. Individual fingers on the hands, facial features, even what looked like hair texture carved in fine lines. He'd made it with simple tools, maybe a sharp stone or broken glass I'd brought. It must have taken hours, maybe days. He offered it to me with a gesture I recognized. This is for you, a gift, an acknowledgement of our bond. I cried. Couldn't help it. This creature who couldn't speak my language, who lived in hiding, who had every reason to fear and hate humanity, had made me a birthday present. I carry it with me always, a reminder of what we were to each other. I brought him a portable DVD player in 2003. I'd gotten curious about how he'd react to moving images. I'd shown him photographs and drawings, but never video I had in nature documentary. Figured that would be least threatening. His reaction was extraordinary. At first he was startled, drew back, touched the screen hesitantly like he thought the animals inside might be real, but once he understood it was images, moving photographs, he was mesmerized. He watched that documentary 3 times in a row, pointing at animals, making sounds, clearly recognizing species. When I showed him a documentary about gorillas, his reaction was even more intense. He watched in absolute silence, barely moving, and afterward he seemed melancholic, like he'd seen something that reminded him of family, of connection, of something he'd lost. October 2003 brought our most dangerous close call, a group calling themselves cryptozoologists. Reality TV wannabes with cameras and thermal imaging equipment set up a base camp about 3 miles from the cave. They were there for 2 weeks, running night expeditions, setting up game cameras, making noise and leaving bait in the woods. Every night I'd hear them whooping and calling, trying to provoke a response. My companion was terrified. He'd retreat to the deepest part of the cave and wouldn't come out until hours after they'd left the area. One night, they came within a 1/4 mile of us. I could hear them clearly, crashing through brush, their radios crackling, their excited voices. "Did you hear that? Get the camera! Over there!" They were following something, probably an elk or bear they'd misidentified, but they were heading in our direction. I made a decision. I hiked out to intercept them, playing the role of angry local landowner. Told them they were trespassing, disturbing wildlife, and if they didn't leave, I'd call the sheriff. They argued, said they had rights to public lands, but they were clearly spooked by my intensity. I might have implied I was armed. I wasn't, but they didn't need to know that they packed up and left the next day. My companion didn't fully relax for a week afterward. In May of 2005, something happened that fundamentally changed my understanding of his intelligence. I'd brought a new magazine, a hiking publication with photographs of various mountain ranges across North America. He was looking through it, as he often did, when he suddenly stopped at a photograph of a mountain range in British Columbia. He stared at it for a long time, then pointed at himself, then at the photograph, then made a gesture. Both arms extended, sweeping back and forth, that I'd learned meant family, or a group. I understood this wasn't just him recognizing a landscape he'd seen. This was him remembering home, his birthplace, where he'd come from, where his family was or had been. "You're from there?" I asked, pointing at the photograph. He made the affirmative gesture we'd developed. "Do you want to go back?" He hesitated. Then he pointed at the photo, made the family gesture, and then made a downward gesture, death or gone. They weren't there anymore, or he couldn't go back, or it wasn't safe. I couldn't get the full nuance with our limited communication, but the emotional weight was clear. He had a past, a home, a family, and he was separated from them. He'd been alone for decades, maybe since he'd been young, and I was all he had. The weight of that responsibility nearly crushed me. By 2005, I was 63 years old. My knees were shot from 2 decades of mountain hiking. I'd had 2 minor heart episodes that I'd hidden from doctors. Because I couldn't risk being told to limit my physical activity, I was on blood pressure medication, anti-inflammatories for arthritis, and I'd started using trekking poles because my balance wasn't what it used to be. The hikes that used to take me 4 hours now took 6. I was slowing down, and I knew it. And I knew what that meant. At some point, I wouldn't be able to make the journey anymore. What happened then? What happened to my companion when I could no longer care for him? The question haunted me. We were both aging, both declining, and neither of us had anyone else. In June of 2006, I was in the town library, rare for me, but I'd been researching something when I came across a reference book on indigenous Pacific Northwest folklore. Curious, I started reading the sections on Sasquatch legends. What I found wasn't legend, it was history disguised as legend. Story after story of wild men in the forests, and story after story of them being hunted, killed, driven away by early settlers and indigenous groups during periods of conflict, burned out of forest areas, shot by trappers and miners, systematically eliminated from populated areas throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. One entry stood out, an 1892 newspaper article from a town in British Columbia, the same region where my companion had indicated he came from, describing a hunt where settlers had tracked and killed 3 ape men they claimed were threatening livestock. The article was triumphant in tone. They'd displayed the bodies, considered it pest control, like killing wolves or cougars. The bodies were apparently buried in an unmarked mass grave when they started to smell. I sat in that library, hands shaking, finally understanding what my companion had been too limited in communication to fully explain. His species hadn't just avoided humans, they'd been systematically hunted, killed, persecuted for over a century. The hiding wasn't paranoia, it was survival strategy based on genocidal violence, and suddenly his fear, his panic at every close call, the way he'd look at me sometimes with an expression that seemed to ask, "Will you do what they did?" It all made horrifying sense. I brought the photocopied articles to the cave. I'd never shown him evidence of his own history before, didn't want to traumatize him, but I needed to know. I needed to understand if what I'd read was true. I showed him the photographs from the book, drawings of Sasquatch from the 1800s, maps showing where sightings and hunts had occurred. His reaction was immediate and devastating. He looked at the images and started making sounds I'd never heard before, high-pitched, anguished keening. He touched the drawings, particularly one that showed a family group, and started rocking back and forth, a self-soothing behavior I recognized from traumatized primates. Then he did something he'd never done. He started drawing. Using charcoal from our fire and a flat rock, he drew crude but unmistakable images, figures representing his species, Human figures with what looked like guns, bodies on the ground, fire-consuming forest. He drew for over an hour, creating a brutal visual narrative. This wasn't legend or folklore. This was memory, either his own or passed down through his culture, stories told by survivors to their children, warnings to never trust humans, never be seen, never reveal themselves. The final drawing broke me. He drew a small figure, a juvenile, I realized, hiding while adults were killed. Then he pointed to himself. He was that juvenile. He'd witnessed the slaughter of his family or his group. He'd survived by hiding, by staying silent, by being overlooked because he was small enough to escape notice. And he'd lived the rest of his life, probably 60, 70, 80 years, alone, in hiding, carrying that trauma, never able to return home, never able to find others because revealing yourself meant death. I sat with him for hours that night, both of us silent, the weight of this knowledge crushing. I'd spent 20 years protecting one individual. But what about the others? If there were others, the species was clearly rare, possibly endangered, possibly on the verge of extinction. And they were invisible by necessity, hiding in the shrinking wilderness, dying in isolation, unable to find mates or form communities because the risk of being noticed, even by each other, was too great. My secrecy protected my companion, but it also enabled the continuing ignorance that threatened his entire species. What was the right choice? Keep him hidden and safe while his kind died out, or reveal the truth and hope that humanity had evolved enough to protect rather than destroy? The moral crisis became acute in September when two things happened simultaneously. First, a university wildlife biology department announced a major study on large predator population dynamics in the North Cascades with plans to deploy trail cameras, DNA analysis, and systematic surveying of the region, including areas very close to the cave. Second, a documentary crew started filming in the area for a show about cryptids drawn by increased sightings reported by hikers and residents. The irony was bitter. The more people looked for Bigfoot, the more danger my companion was in. The research team was scheduled to begin in spring 2007. They'd be everywhere, systematically covering terrain, installing motion-activated cameras, collecting hair and tissue samples from branches and bushes. There was no way they wouldn't find evidence, hair samples, footprints, possibly even the cave itself. The net was closing, and I had 6 months to decide what to do. In October, we discovered a trail camera mounted on a tree less than 500 yards from the cave entrance. It hadn't been there the week before. Someone, researcher, documentary crew, amateur enthusiast, had placed it in an area they thought promising. My companion and I found it during a routine walk. He recognized what it was immediately. I'd shown him cameras over the years, and his panic was instantaneous. We were being watched. The camera was aimed directly at a game trail he used frequently. I disabled it, took the memory card, which showed deer, elk, one black bear, and thankfully no images of my companion. We'd found it in time. But I knew this was just the beginning. If there was one camera, there would be more. The surveillance technology that had seemed like a minor threat in the 90s was now everywhere, cheap, effective, and ubiquitous. We couldn't avoid it forever. The forest was becoming transparent. In November, I tried to explain the situation to my companion using our communication system, supplemented with drawings and gestures. I showed him maps, drew stick figures representing researchers, explained as best I could that many people would be looking soon and hiding would become almost impossible. I drew two paths, one where we continued hiding with increasing danger and one where I revealed his existence with unknown consequences. I asked him as directly as I could with our limited shared language what he wanted. His response was complex. He pointed to himself, then made the hiding gesture. Clear. He wanted to stay hidden, but then he made the family gesture, pointed to the map showing the broader region, and made a questioning gesture. Others? Where? Are there others? He wanted to know if there were more of his kind, and if there were, what would happen to them. His thinking was sophisticated. He understood that his individual safety might conflict with the survival of his species. and he was asking me to consider the larger picture. The crisis accelerated in December when my companion developed a respiratory infection that rapidly worsened into pneumonia. His breathing became labored, his fever spiked above 104 degrees, and he was coughing so hard he couldn't sleep. I brought antibiotics, but they weren't working fast enough. By Christmas, he was critically ill, possibly dying, and I faced an impossible choice. Let him die to preserve the secret, or bring in help and expose him. I chose exposure, or started to. I drove to Concrete, found the one doctor in town I thought might be sympathetic. Dr. Sarah Chen, a young GP who'd moved up from Seattle, seemed less conventional than most, and told her I had a friend in the mountains who was critically ill and couldn't come to town. I asked what antibiotic would be most effective for severe pneumonia. She asked questions: height, weight, symptoms. I gave her vague answers. She prescribed a broad-spectrum antibiotic and asked if I wanted her to come with me to check on this friend. I said no. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she knew I was lying, but she gave me the medication and made me promise to bring my friend in if they didn't improve within 48 hours. The antibiotics worked. Within 3 days, the fever broke. Within a week, he was breathing normally again. But the experience had changed something. He'd nearly died, I'd nearly lost him. And I'd come within a hair's breadth of revealing him to a stranger. We both understood how fragile our situation was, how tenuous his survival, how the world was closing in. In late January, during a cold, clear night, he did something unprecedented. Using our communication system, gestures, drawings, the simple sign language we'd developed, he told me a story. It took hours. It was halting, incomplete, limited by our communication barriers. But I understood enough. He told me about his family, about being young, maybe equivalent to a human teenager, about the attack, humans with guns and fire coming into the forest, hunting them deliberately, about hiding while his parents were killed, about wandering alone for years, avoiding all human contact, nearly starving, learning to stay invisible about the bear trap that had caught him 21 years earlier, and his certainty that he would die there, that the humans would find him and finish what they'd started decades before, about his shock when I'd helped instead of hurt, about how I was the only positive experience with humans in his entire life. And then he asked me something, as clearly as he could, with our limited language. Did I think humans had changed? Could his kind ever be safe? Was it possible that revelation wouldn't mean death? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. But his willingness to even ask the question told me he was considering it. Considering the possibility that hiding forever wasn't the answer. That maybe, just maybe, the world had changed enough that truth was safer than secrecy. Or at least, that secrecy was no longer sustainable. In mid-February, I received notice that the land where my cabin sat was being acquired by the National Forest through eminent domain as part of a wilderness expansion project. I had 6 months to relocate, which meant I'd be much farther away from the cave, which meant daily visits would become impossible, which meant my companion would be alone again, just as surveillance in the area was intensifying. The tipping point had arrived. Continue as we had been, which was no longer viable, or make a radical change. I knew what I had to do, even though it terrified me. I needed to document everything, gather evidence, find someone who could help, and trust that humanity had learned something in the century since my companion's family was murdered. I spent March gathering evidence. 22 years of documentation, notebooks filled with observations, sketches, communication charts, behavioral notes. But I needed more. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed. With my companion's nervous consent, he understood what I was doing, understood the risk. I took photographs, not many, maybe 20 over the course of the month. His hands, his face, his full body, standing next to me for scale, the cave entrance, his tools, the carvings he'd made, his footprints with measuring tape for reference. Each photograph felt like a betrayal, but he endured it because he understood the alternative was worse. I collected hair samples, took soil samples from the cave floor that might contain his DNA. I even managed to get a blood sample. He cut his hand on a sharp rock, and I soaked it up with gauze before cleaning the wound, all of it, carefully labeled, documented, stored in waterproof containers. Evidence that would survive even if I didn't. And I wrote everything. The complete story from that first day in 1985 to the present, names, dates, locations, everything. I wrote 2 versions, one with specific location details for scientific purposes, and one with locations obscured for public release if necessary. The full version was stored in a safety deposit box with instructions to be opened by Dr. Chen in the event of my death. The redacted version I kept with me. In early April, I returned to Dr. Chen. I told her I needed to talk to her about the friend she'd given me antibiotics for in December. She invited me into her office after hours. I sat across from her desk, this complete evidence packet in my backpack, and I made a judgment call about human character. I decided to trust her. "My friend isn't human," I said, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through disbelief, skepticism, fascination, and finally, professional curiosity. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Show me the evidence." I showed her the photographs, the documentation, the hair samples. She studied everything with scientific precision, asking detailed questions about his physiology, behavior, communication ability. Finally, she said, "If this is real, and I'm not saying I believe it yet, but if it is, you need to be very careful about who you tell. There are people who would want to study him, capture him, treat him like a specimen rather than an individual. There are others who'd want to kill him, either out of fear or for trophy. You need institutional protection before you go public." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm coming to you first. You're a doctor. You understand medical ethics, patient confidentiality. Do no harm. I need someone who'll see him as a person, not a thing. Can you help me?" She hesitated. Then, "I need to see him, in person. If he's real, if he's intelligent as you claim, then yes, I'll help you. But I need to verify this isn't an elaborate hoax or a case of you having spent too long alone in the woods." Convincing my companion to meet Dr. Chen was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He was terrified. Every instinct he had screamed danger. But I explained, using our signs, our drawings, our 2-decade vocabulary, that she was a healer, like I'd been to him, that she wanted to help, not hurt, that we needed her if others of his kind were to be safe. He understood. But understanding didn't make him less afraid. We arranged the meeting for late evening. At the cave, Dr. Chen hiked in with me, a difficult journey, she wasn't accustomed to wilderness travel, and approached the cave with obvious nervousness. My companion was deep inside, visible only as a shadow. I called to him softly, using the greeting vocalization he'd taught me years ago. He emerged slowly, stopped about 15 feet from where we stood. Dr. Chen gasped. Actually gasped. Then, to her credit, she recovered her professional composure. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "My name is Sarah. I'm a doctor. I'm here to help." She held up both hands, palms out, the universal gesture for peaceful intent. My companion looked at me. I nodded. "It's okay." He looked at Dr. Chen and carefully, deliberately repeated her gesture. Hands up, palms out, peace. Dr. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He understands. He's really—" She couldn't finish, but she understood. This wasn't an animal. This was a person. Over the next month, Dr. Chen visited 3 more times, each time staying longer, earning trust gradually. She conducted a basic medical examination with his consent, conveyed through our gesture system. She documented his physical characteristics with scientific precision. Height, 8 feet 1 inch. Weight, approximately 680 pounds. Dental structure, similar to great apes but with unique features. Hand morphology, opposable thumbs, fine motor control. And most significantly, skull shape, suggesting large cranial capacity consistent with high intelligence. She took DNA samples, hair follicles, buccal swabs. She'd send them to a lab she trusted with a cover story about analyzing primate samples. The results, when they came back, were extraordinary. The DNA was hominid, but distinctly different from Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, or any known primate species a unique evolutionary branch. Evidence of a separate species of human that had somehow survived into modernity. This changes everything, Dr. Chen said when she shared the DNA results. This is the most important biological discovery in a century. But it also means he's incredibly vulnerable. If this gets out wrong, if the wrong people find out first, he'll never be safe. We need to do this carefully, very carefully. We developed a strategy. Dr. Chen would approach the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, a legitimate scientific organization with ethical oversight. She'd present preliminary evidence, without specific locations, and argue for the establishment of a protected study protocol before any public announcement. The goal was institutional protection first, revelation second. We'd advocate for treating the species, if others existed, as an endangered population deserving of habitat protection and non-interference policies, not as subjects for invasive research. My companion was part of these discussions, as much as he could be with our communication limitations. He understood we were trying to create safety for his species. He understood the risks. And in a profound gesture of trust, he agreed. He'd stay hidden during initial negotiations, but if scientific authorities demanded proof before providing protection, he would reveal himself under controlled conditions. It was an extraordinary act of courage, overcoming a lifetime of trauma-based fear to take a chance on human decency. In one of our last conversations before the process began, my companion drew something that I've kept, that I've shown to every scientist and official I've worked with. Since he drew two groups of figures, one representing humans, one representing his kind. Between them, he drew a line. On one side of the line, he drew weapons and fire, the history of persecution. On the other side, he drew what looked like extended hands, a different possibility. Then he pointed to me and drew me on the side with the extended hands. Then he drew a question mark. Would others be like me, or like the hunters? That drawing encapsulated everything. His entire species was making a judgment about humanity based on limited evidence. They'd hidden for over a century because the evidence said humans were killers. I was an exception that suggested humans might have changed. The revelation we were planning was essentially asking his species to trust that I wasn't an outlier, that humanity had evolved past the violence that had driven them into hiding. It was a huge gamble, and he was willing to make it because the alternative, continued hiding until extinction, was worse. On June 15, 2007, Dr. Chen sent the email to the AAPA committee, subject line, "Evidence of extant hominid species requires immediate ethical review." Attached were preliminary photographs, face obscured for protection, DNA analysis, and a summary of behavioral observations. The moment she hit send, there was no going back. Within 48 hours, we'd have a response. And whatever that response was, it would determine not just my companion's fate, but possibly the fate of his entire species. We waited, both of us understanding that everything, 22 years of secrecy, trust, friendship, sacrifice, was about to be tested. The APA response came within 36 hours, not dismissal, as I'd feared, but intense interest tempered with extreme caution. They wanted verification before involving any broader institutional structure. They'd send a 3-person committee, a biological anthropologist, a primatologist, and a geneticist, to examine the evidence in person. Complete confidentiality, no recording devices, no disclosure of location. They understood the sensitivity. They understood that if this was real, it was the most significant biological discovery since DNA structure, and it required extraordinary protection protocols. Dr. Margaret Hayes, Dr. Robert Yoshida, and Dr. Patricia Okonkwo arrived in late July. I led them into the backcountry, a grueling 8-hour hike, necessary to protect the location. My companion was terrified. Showing himself to one human had been traumatic enough. 3 strangers, staring, analyzing, judging. It went against every survival instinct he had, but he did it. He stepped out of the cave, stood in full view, allowed them to see him. The scientists' reactions were everything I'd hoped for. No screaming, no panic, no aggression, just stunned, reverent silence. Dr. Hayes started crying. Dr. Yoshida literally sat down hard, legs giving out. Dr. Okonkwo whispered, "Oh my God," over and over. Then, professionally, they began their examination. They were respectful, asking permission through gestures before any physical contact, working slowly, explaining what they were doing, even though they weren't sure he understood. He tolerated it with remarkable patience, occasionally looking at me for reassurance, which I gave. They spent 2 days at the cave, documenting, examining, collecting samples. They verified the DNA results. They observed his tool use. He showed them how he made simple cordage from plant fibers, how he shaped stones for specific purposes. They documented his communication with me, recording our gesture exchanges. When they left, Dr. Hayes told me, "This is real. He's real. And we have a responsibility to protect him and any others. We'll advocate for protection first policies before any public announcement. You have my word." The AAPA committee's report to their board triggered an immediate, intense debate. One faction argued for complete containment, study the individual, protect the location, but don't reveal publicly until more was known about potential population size and distribution. The risk of revelation, they argued, was that every amateur hunter and cryptid enthusiast in North America would flood the wilderness, making actual protection impossible. The other faction argued for limited public revelation, announce the discovery, establish immediate endangered species protections, and use public pressure to ensure government agencies protected habitat rather than exploited it. Secrecy, they argued, benefited no one and left any existing population vulnerable to accidental or deliberate harm by individuals who had no idea what they were encountering. I was consulted. So was Dr. Chen. And as best we could through our limited communication, so was my companion. The question came down to this: was his species better protected by silence or by law? There was no good answer. Both approaches had risks. We were trying to predict human behavior at scale. Would revelation bring protection or persecution? We had one data point suggesting humans could be compassionate, me. We had centuries of data suggesting the opposite. The decision was made moot when, in early October, a lab technician who'd processed the DNA samples figured out what they were from and told a friend who told a reporter by mid-October. A regional newspaper ran a story. Scientists claim evidence of real Bigfoot. It was sensationalized, inaccurate in details, but the core was true. The secret was out. Within days, the story went national, then international. The speculation, the debate, the conspiracy theories, it was instant chaos. The AAPA was forced to issue a statement confirming that credible evidence of an unknown hominid species had been documented, that the individual in question was under scientific protection, and that location details were being withheld to prevent harassment. This only intensified interest. News crews descended on the region. The Forest Service was overwhelmed with permit requests from researchers, documentary crews, and amateur investigators. Local businesses started selling Bigfoot merchandise. It was a circus. By late October, federal agencies asserted jurisdiction. The Fish and Wildlife Service claimed authority under the Endangered Species Act. The Forest Service claimed land management jurisdiction. Homeland Security absurdly claimed potential national security interest. The logic being that an unknown hominid species could pose unspecified security risks. The FBI got involved because of death threats I'd received from people who either thought I was lying and deserved punishment, or thought I was hiding a creature that should be killed. A joint task force was formed. I was interrogated, there's no other word for it, for hours, explaining every detail, justifying my decisions, defending my 22 years of secrecy. They wanted the location. I refused unless they guaranteed protection. Standoff ensued. Dr. Chen had my legal documentation in her safety deposit box, proof of everything, and she'd gone public with its existence, creating a dead man's switch. If anything happened to me or my companion, the full story with locations would be released to media. It was the only leverage we had. After weeks of negotiation mediated by the AAPA and environmental law organizations, an agreement was reached. The area around the cave, a 25-square-mile radius, would be designated a special scientific preserve closed to all public access. A small research team, vetted and overseen by an ethics committee, would be allowed limited, non-invasive observation. I would be allowed continued access as the primary liaison, the one person my companion trusted. Any attempt to capture, relocate, or conduct invasive research on him would be prosecuted as assault on an endangered individual. It wasn't perfect. It meant his location was now known to dozens of officials. It meant periodic checkups and monitoring he didn't want. It meant restrictions on even my access. I had to apply for permits, sign forms, submit reports. His home had become a bureaucratic zone. But it also meant legal protection, armed enforcement of the perimeter, and institutional commitment to his safety. The public reaction was everything we'd feared and hoped: fascination. Legitimate researchers from around the world wanted to study him, requests we mostly denied. Conservation organizations rallied to protect potential habitat in other regions where others might exist. Exploitation, offers from zoos, private collectors, even a circus to house him, all rejected with extreme prejudice. Skepticism. Large portions of the public simply didn't believe, considered it an elaborate hoax, despite the scientific documentation. And finally, danger. Hunters who wanted to kill him to prove he existed or claim a trophy, believers who wanted to free him from government control, and conspiracy theorists who thought he was a government experiment or alien hybrid. Security had to be constant. Rangers patrolled the perimeter. Motion sensors and cameras, oh, the irony, were installed to detect intrusions. There were 3 serious breach attempts in the first 6 months. One by a documentary crew that tried to sneak in at night, one by a group claiming to be a Bigfoot Liberation Front, and one by what appeared to be a private military contractor working for an unknown client. All were arrested. The message was clear: he was protected now. But that protection came with a siege mentality. The impact on him was profound and mixed. On one hand, he was safer than he'd ever been. No more constant fear of discovery. No more hiding from helicopters and survey crews. For the first time in his life, he could exist without the exhausting vigilance that had defined his existence. On the other hand, he'd lost privacy, lost the peaceful isolation he'd maintained for decades. The forest around his home was now filled with human activity, patrols, research teams, the distant sound of vehicles and voices. We'd traded one kind of fear for another. He stopped going outside as much, stayed deeper in the cave. The openness and curiosity he developed over our years together, the willingness to explore, to interact with the items I brought him, diminished. He was depressed. That's the only word for it. I could see it in his posture, his reduced engagement, the way he'd sit for hours doing nothing. We'd saved his life from immediate threats, but we'd destroyed the life he'd built. I struggled with guilt constantly. Had I made the right choice? Was protected imprisonment better than free hiding? For me, the revelation cost me what little privacy and normalcy I had left. I became the man who hid Bigfoot. Media attention was relentless. My face was everywhere. Interviews, documentaries, talk shows, all requesting, all demanding. I refused almost all of them, which made me seem suspicious, made conspiracy theories flourish. People accused me of profiting. I wasn't. I lived on a Forest Service stipend for my liaison work. People accused me of lying, despite overwhelming evidence. People showed up at my new cabin, wanting autographs, wanting to interview me, wanting to argue with me about whether my companion was real or a man in a suit. I lost what few friendships I had. People either couldn't handle the weirdness or wanted to exploit the connection. I was 65 years old, exhausted, grieving the simple relationship we'd had before the world intruded. But I reminded myself, this wasn't about my comfort. This was about his survival, and the survival of any others. If the price of species protection was my privacy, it was a price worth paying. One consequence I hadn't fully anticipated: the revelation triggered intensive searches for others of his kind. Research teams, using the DNA profile as a reference, started analyzing historical hair and tissue samples collected over decades from various locations, environmental DNA sampling in remote wilderness areas, acoustic monitoring for vocalizations matching patterns we documented, satellite imagery analysis looking for structures or activity patterns consistent with a hiding population. Results were ambiguous. Some potential evidence in British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest, and Northern California suggested a remnant population might exist, perhaps dozens, possibly a few hundred individuals widely dispersed, but nothing definitive. If others existed, they were still successfully hiding. My companion's people had learned their lessons well. Invisibility was survival. The scientific consensus became that the species was critically endangered, possibly functionally extinct, with my companion potentially one of the last living individuals. The weight of that possibility, that I was caring for one of the last of his kind, was crushing. By 2010, 3 years after the revelation, broader protection measures were in place. Large sections of wilderness in Washington, British Columbia, and Northern California were designated as sensitive hominid habitat, zones where logging was restricted, recreational access was limited, and development was prohibited. It wasn't perfect, economic interests fought every restriction, but it was something. If others existed, they had legally protected space to exist in. I'm 82 years old now. My companion is elderly too. We've estimated he's somewhere in his 90s, ancient for his species, if our biological assessments are correct. He's gray all over now, moves slowly, sleeps most of the day. His arthritis is severe despite medication. He's going blind in one eye. He's dying and we both know it. I visit him every day. I'm physically able. 3-4 times a week now, my own health declining. Each visit might be the last. That knowledge colors everything. 40 years ago, I made a choice to save his life. 22 years ago, I made a choice to reveal his existence. I'm asked constantly which decision I regret. Neither, and both. I don't regret saving him. That was instinct, compassion, the right thing to do in the moment. I don't regret revealing him. Secrecy had become unsustainable, and his species needed legal protection more than they needed invisibility. But I regret what those decisions cost. I regret that he spent the last years of his life in what amounts to protective custody rather than peaceful isolation. I regret that my attempt to save his species may have failed. Despite extensive searches, no definitive evidence of others has been found. He may die the last of his kind. That possibility haunts me. The revelation changed scientific understanding of human evolution. My companion's DNA filled in gaps, suggested parallel evolutionary paths, challenged assumptions about hominid extinction timelines. There are papers, conferences, textbooks that now include his species, tentatively named Homo sylvanus, forest human. That's something. It's knowledge where there was ignorance. The revelation changed conservation policy. Wilderness protection arguments now include the possibility of unknown species requiring habitat. That's resulted in measurably more protected land, stricter development restrictions. Other species benefited from protections meant for his kind. That's something too. But it didn't change human nature as much as I'd hoped. There are still people who'd kill him given the chance, still people who see him as a specimen, a commodity, a thing, rather than a person. Still people who don't believe despite overwhelming evidence. Prejudice, cruelty, exploitation, those haven't disappeared. We gave him legal protection, but we couldn't give him social acceptance. He's still feared, still othered, still fundamentally alone. What I learned over 4 decades is that intelligence creates ethical obligations. The moment I recognized his intelligence, that moment when we locked eyes and I saw a person, not an animal, I became responsible for his well-being. Not because I wanted that responsibility, but because awareness creates duty. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unsee personhood once you've seen it. I learned that trust is built in moments, but sustained over years. Every time I showed up at that cave, Every time I brought food or medicine or just companionship, I was reinforcing that I was different from the humans he'd learned to fear. Trust isn't granted, it's earned, maintained, proven continuously. I learned that some secrets protect and some secrets harm, and knowing which is which requires impossible judgment. For 22 years, I kept him secret, believing that was protection. When I revealed him, I believed that was protection too. Both were true, both were false. The right choice exists in context, not in principle, and you can only judge by the specific circumstances you face. I did what seemed right at each decision point. Whether it was actually right, I'll never fully know. What remains? A protected preserve in the Cascade Mountains, a body of scientific knowledge about a species we nearly lost legal precedents for protecting undiscovered or remnant populations, and one elderly individual living in a cave cared for by rangers and researchers who never knew him before he became a scientific subject. It's not the legacy I'd hoped for. I'd hoped for the discovery of others, a thriving population, a species pulled back from extinction. That didn't happen. Maybe it still could. Maybe somewhere in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, others are surviving, still invisible. But probably not. Probably he's the last. And when he dies, an entire species dies with him. If I could talk to my younger self, standing in that ravine in 1985, I'd tell him, "You're about to meet someone who will teach you what it means to be truly alone, someone who carries generational trauma in his very bones. Someone who has every reason to hate humanity and who will instead learn to trust one human. Pay attention. This is a gift not for you, for the world. This is a chance to understand that intelligence and personhood aren't defined by species, that ethical consideration extends beyond familiar boundaries, that preservation sometimes means visibility and sometimes means secrecy, and wisdom is knowing which is needed when." What I want people to understand is that my companion isn't a monster, a myth, or a curiosity. He's a person shaped by historical trauma, surviving against impossible odds, deserving of dignity and safety. His species learned to hide because we taught them that visibility meant death. They became invisible because we made visibility lethal. Their extinction, if it comes, is on us. Our violence, our expansion, our inability to share space with intelligence that looks different from ours. If they're gone, we killed them. Not through one dramatic event, but through 1,000 thoughtless acts of habitat destruction, sport hunting, fear-based violence spread across centuries. I'm 82 years old. I've lived long enough to see patterns. Humanity changes, slowly, incompletely, but genuinely. We're less casually violent than we were in the 1800s when my companion's family was killed. We have frameworks now for species protection, for ethical treatment, for considering non-human intelligence. It's not enough, but it's something. My hope, faint but present, is that if others of his kind exist, they'll outlive our worst impulses. They'll stay hidden until we've evolved enough that revealing themselves won't be suicide. Maybe in another century, another hunting guide will find an injured member of his species, and that person will have a better world to bring them into than I did last week. I visited the cave. It took me 6 hours. I'm slow now, my knees are shot, my heart isn't what it was. But I made it. He was sleeping when I arrived, curled up in the back chamber, wrapped in the blanket I'd brought him 30 years ago, now threadbare, but still precious to him. I sat with him for a while, just being present. Eventually, he woke, saw me, made the soft huffing sound that means welcome, that means friend, that means I'm glad you're here. We didn't communicate much, we're both beyond words at this point. But he reached out, like he'd done that first day 40 years ago, and touched my shoulder. Just rested his hand there. I covered his hand with mine. Two old people, two different species, two survivors of a relationship that shouldn't have been possible, but somehow was. We sat like that for maybe an hour. No words, no gestures, just companionship, just the quiet acknowledgement of shared history, shared survival, shared affection that has no name, because language can't quite capture what we are to each other. When I left, he watched me go the way he always does, standing at the cave entrance until I'm out of sight. I don't know if I'll see him again. I don't know if I'll make the hike again or if he'll still be alive when I do. But I know this. We gave each other something rare. He taught me that intelligence exists in forms we don't expect, that trust can bridge species, that survival sometimes means accepting help from the very thing you've learned to fear. And I hope I taught him that not all humans are hunters, that kindness exists, that he deserved to be safe. That was his gift to me, the privilege of being trusted, of being the exception, of being proof that humans could be different. And I'll carry that until I die. Some friendships transcend species, some secrets are worth keeping, and some truths, when they're finally told, might not save the world, but they remind us what's worth saving. His name, if such a thing can be translated, means something like the one who waits. He's been waiting his whole life, waiting for safety, waiting for his family, waiting for a world where his kind doesn't have to hide. I hope he doesn't have to wait much longer.